The smell of whiskey and desperation clung to Quinton Morrison like a second skin as he stumbled through the freezing November night in Socorro, New Mexico, his ribs aching from hunger and his boots worn clean through at the soles. The year was 1878, and he had been wandering for 3 days without food, driven from the last town by men who claimed he had stolen livestock, a lie spread by a rancher whose advances toward Quinton's sister he had rejected with his fists before she died of fever that following winter. Now he had nothing, not even the dignity of choosing where he would lay his head, and when the barkeeper at the Silver Dollar Saloon offered him a warm place to sleep in exchange for working the night hauling barrels and cleaning spittoons, Quinton took it without hesitation, unaware that the transaction had been observed by a woman whose life would become entwined with his in ways neither could imagine. Evangeline Harper sat in the corner of that same saloon, her green eyes tracking every movement in the smoke-filled room with the wariness of someone who had learned to read danger in the tilt of a hat or the placement of a hand near a holster. She was 22 years old, though the hardness in her expression made her seem older, and she had come to Socorro 3 months earlier fleeing a marriage arrangement her father had made with a cattle baron twice her age in Santa Fe. Her father, a failed prospector turned drunk, had sold her future for enough money to fund another year of digging in played-out silver mines, and Evangeline had chosen the uncertainty of survival over the certainty of misery. She worked now as a seamstress, her skilled fingers mending the torn shirts and pants of miners and cowboys, but the pay was meager and her landlord had made it clear that she had 1 week to produce the rent money or find herself on the street. She watched Quinton haul a barrel twice his weight across the saloon floor, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat despite the cold, and something in the determined set of his jaw caught her attention. Most men in his position wore defeat like a badge, but this one moved with purpose, as though hard work was its own reward. When he paused to catch his breath, she saw the way his hand pressed against his side and recognized the gesture of someone trying to hide pain from hunger. Without fully understanding why, Evangeline stood and made her way to the bar, purchasing 2 plates of the stew the saloon served for dinner. The barkeeper, a man named Dutch with a scar running from his ear to his chin, raised an eyebrow but said nothing as she carried both plates to a small table near where Quinton worked. "You look like you could use this more than I could eat both," she said simply, setting 1 plate down and gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Quinton stared at her for a long moment, suspicion and hope warring in his blue eyes. He was 24, tall and lean in the way of men who had known more hunger than plenty, and there was something in his face that spoke of education and refinement, now buried under layers of dirt and desperation. "I don't take charity," he said, but his voice cracked on the last word, betraying how badly he wanted to accept. "Then consider it payment for conversation," Evangeline replied, beginning to eat her own portion. "I have had nothing but the company of men who talk of nothing but silver strikes and card games for 3 months. Surely you can offer better than that." Something in her tone, matter of fact rather than pitying, made Quinton sit. He ate slowly at first, as though afraid the food might disappear, then with increasing hunger. Between bites, he told her his story, the false accusation, the death of his sister, the long road that had brought him to Socorro with nothing but the clothes on his back. Evangeline listened without interrupting, recognizing in his tale echoes of her own displacement. When he finished, she told him about Santa Fe, about her father's betrayal, about the life she had built here from nothing but stubbornness and thread. They talked until the saloon began to empty, until Dutch called last rounds and the piano player packed up his instrument. Quinton returned to his work, but something had shifted in the air between them. A recognition of kindred spirits cast adrift in a harsh world. "I have a proposition," Evangeline said as Quinton prepared to bed down in the back room Dutch had promised him. "I need someone to help me expand my sewing business. The miners are desperate for someone who can mend their work clothes quickly, and I cannot keep up with the demand alone. I can pay room and board and a small wage once we are established." Quinton looked at her with surprise. "I don't know the first thing about sewing, but you can learn," she said. "And you can help with deliveries, with keeping the books, with 100 other things. I need someone I can trust, and I think you might be that person." The offer hung between them like a lifeline thrown across treacherous water. Quinton knew he should be suspicious, should wonder what she wanted from him beyond labor, but exhaustion and hope made him reckless. "Why would you trust me? You just met me." Evangeline smiled, and for the first time that evening the hardness left her face. "Because you did not lie about what brought you here, even though a more comfortable story would have been easy to tell. And because I recognize the look of someone who has been pushed to the edge and refused to jump." That night, Quinton slept in the back room of the saloon as agreed, but his dreams were filled with the possibility of something more than survival. When morning came, he found Evangeline waiting outside with a bundle of clean clothes and a pair of boots that looked like they might actually fit. "These were my brother's," she said, handing them over. "He died of cholera 2 years ago in Colorado. He would want them to go to someone who needed them." The boots fit perfectly, and as Quinton laced them up, he felt the first stirring of something he had not experienced in months. The sense that maybe his luck had finally turned. Evangeline's sewing shop was a small room above the general store, reached by an exterior staircase that creaked alarmingly with each step. Inside, the space was crowded with fabric bolts, a single sewing machine that looked like it had seen better days, and a table covered with half-finished projects. A small stove in the corner provided heat, and a curtained-off section at the back served as Evangeline's living quarters. "You can sleep here," she said, pointing to a space near the stove. "It is not much, but it is warm and dry." Over the following days, Quinton learned the rhythm of Evangeline's business. She woke before dawn to work by lamplight, her fingers flying over fabric with practiced precision. He took over the deliveries, hauling repaired clothes to the mining camps that dotted the hills around Socorro, collecting payment and new orders. In the evenings, she taught him basic stitching, showing him how to reinforce seams and patch tiers, and he surprised both of them by having a steady hand and an eye for detail. They fell into an easy partnership, their conversations growing deeper as the weeks passed. Evangeline told him about growing up in Santa Fe, about her mother who had died when she was 12, leaving her to raise her younger brother while her father drank away his grief. Quinton spoke of his childhood in St. Louis, where his father had been a schoolteacher and his mother a piano instructor, and how their deaths from fever had left him and his sister to make their way west in search of opportunity that had never materialized. "You ever regret coming west?" Evangeline asked one evening as they sat by the stove, her hands busy with mending even as they talked. "Every day," Quinton admitted, "but regret does not change anything. We can only move forward." "That is a bleak philosophy." "Maybe, but it is honest." December arrived with cold winds that rattled the windows and made the stove the center of their small world. Business picked up as miners sought to repair their winter gear, and Evangeline hired Quinton officially, paying him a small wage that he saved carefully in a tin hidden under his bedroll. They worked long hours, but there was a companionship in the labor that neither had experienced before, a sense of building something together that went beyond mere survival. It was on a particularly cold evening, with snow beginning to fall outside, that things shifted between them. They had been working late to complete an order for one of the larger mining operations, and exhaustion had made them both punchy with laughter over small mistakes and silly observations. Evangeline pricked her finger on a needle and let out a curse that would have made a miner blush, and Quinton laughed so hard he had to set down the shirt he was hemming. "It is not that funny," she protested. But she was laughing too, and when their eyes met across the work table, something electric passed between them. The laughter faded, replaced by a awareness that made the air feel thick. Quinton stood, crossing to where Evangeline sat, and gently took her hand to examine the small bead of blood on her fingertip. He pressed his handkerchief against it, his touch careful and warm, and when he looked up, her face was inches from his. "Evangeline," he said softly, and her name on his lips felt like a question and an answer all at once. She kissed him first, rising from her chair to close the distance between them, and the kiss was everything neither of them had allowed themselves to hope for. Tender and hungry, careful and desperate. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and for a long moment they simply held each other. Two people who had been alone for so long they had forgotten what connection felt like. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Evangeline's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I did not bring you here for this," she said quickly. "I want you to know that. I truly needed help with the business." "I know," Quinton replied, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, "but I am glad it happened anyway." They talked late into the night, sitting close together by the stove, discussing what this meant and where it could go. Both were cautious, scarred by past betrayals and disappointments, but both were also hungry for the connection they had found. They agreed to take things slowly, to see where this path might lead without rushing toward destinations that might not be ready for them. The winter deepened, and with it, so did their relationship. They were careful to maintain propriety in public, aware that Socorro was a small town where reputations could be destroyed by rumors, but in private, they grew increasingly comfortable with each other. Quinton learned the way Evangeline hummed while she worked, the small crease that appeared between her eyebrows when she concentrated, the way she laughed with her whole body when something truly delighted her. Evangeline discovered that Quinton could quote poetry from memory, that he had a beautiful singing voice he rarely used, and that his quiet strength was not the absence of emotion, but the careful control of deep feelings. In January of 1879, a blizzard struck Socorro with unexpected ferocity, trapping them in the shop for 3 days. They burned through their supply of firewood and had to break up an old chair to keep the stove going, huddling together for warmth under every blanket and piece of fabric they owned. It was during those 3 days, isolated from the world, that their relationship became something neither could deny or pull back from. They made love for the first time on the second night, a slow and tender exploration that left them both shaken by the intensity of emotion it provoked. "I love you," Quinton whispered against her hair as they lay tangled together afterward. "I know it is too soon to say it, but it is true." "It is not too soon," Evangeline replied, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "I love you too. I think I have since that first night in the saloon." When the blizzard finally cleared, they emerged into a world transformed by snow, and it felt fitting somehow, as though nature itself was acknowledging the change that had occurred between them. They held hands as they walked to the general store for supplies, no longer caring who might see, and if the townspeople noticed, no one said anything. Perhaps there was something in the way they moved together that made their connection obvious and unassailable. As winter gave way to spring, their business flourished. Word spread about the quality of Evangeline's work and the reliability of Quinton's deliveries, and orders came in from ranches and mining operations throughout the territory. They hired 2 local women to help with basic mending, allowing Evangeline to focus on more complex projects and Quinton to expand their reach to new customers. They began to talk about the future, about expanding to a larger space, about building something permanent. But Socorro, like all frontier towns, had its share of trouble, and it arrived in April in the form of Marcus Boone. The cattle baron Evangeline's father had tried to sell her to back in Santa Fe. He rode into town with 6 hired men, looking prosperous and mean, and made his way directly to the sewing shop. Quinton was out making deliveries when Boone arrived, and Evangeline found herself facing the man alone. He was in his 50s, with silver-shot hair and cold gray eyes, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no and meant it to stay that way. "Miss Harper," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated politeness, "your father told me I might find you here." Evangeline's blood ran cold. "My father is dead to me. Whatever arrangement you made with him died when I left Santa Fe." "Now, that is no way to talk," Boone said, stepping into the shop uninvited. "Your father owes me a considerable debt, both in money and honor. I paid good coin for the promise of marriage, and I intend to collect on that promise." "I am not property to be bought and sold," Evangeline said, her hand moving subtly toward the scissors on her work table. "And I will not marry you, regardless of what my father promised." Boone's expression hardened. "I had hoped you would be reasonable about this. I am a patient man, Miss Harper, but my patience has limits. You have 1 week to prepare yourself. I will return with a preacher, and we will settle this matter properly." "If you come back here, you will be met with the sheriff," Evangeline said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. Boone laughed, a sound without humor. "Sheriff Coleman and I have an understanding. He will not interfere in matters of honor and debt. 1 week, Miss Harper. Make your peace with it." He left, and Evangeline stood frozen for a long moment, the scissors clutched in her trembling hand. When Quinton returned an hour later, he found her pale and shaking, and the story poured out of her in a rush. "We will go to the sheriff," Quinton said immediately, his jaw tight with anger. "This is extortion, pure and simple." But when they went to Sheriff Coleman that afternoon, they found Boone had been telling the truth. The sheriff, a weathered man in his 60s, listened to their story with a sympathetic expression but shook his head when they finished. "Marcus Boone is a powerful man," Coleman said heavily. "He brings a lot of business through this territory, and he has friends in high places. If he says there was a contract with your father and he has proof of payment, then legally he might have a claim." "A claim to what?" Quinton demanded. "To force a woman into marriage against her will. That cannot be legal." "It is not that simple in frontier law," Coleman replied. "Promises between men, especially when money changes hands, are taken seriously. I am sorry, but unless you can prove fraud or provide restitution for the money he paid, I cannot help you." They left the sheriff's office in stunned silence, and as they walked back to the shop, Quinton's mind raced through options. They could run, leave Socorro and start over somewhere else, but Boone had men and resources, and he seemed the type to hold a grudge. They could fight, but Quinton had no gun and no experience with violence beyond that one confrontation that had cost him everything. They could try to raise the money Boone claimed he was owed, but Evangeline had said it was a substantial sum, far more than their fledgling business had in savings. "There has to be a way," Quinton said as they climbed the stairs to the shop. "I will not let him take you." Evangeline turned to face him, and there were tears in her eyes but also a fierce determination. Maybe we should run, leave tonight before he comes back, and spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. Quinton shook his head. No, we have built something here together. I will not let him steal that from us. That evening, as they tried to work but found themselves too distracted to focus, there was a knock at the door. Quinton answered it to find an elderly Mexican woman with kind eyes and a basket of bread. "I am Teresa Morales," she said in lightly accented English. "I heard about your trouble with Senor Boone." Evangeline appeared behind Quinton, and Teresa's expression softened. "May I come in? I have something important to tell you." They invited her in, and over cups of coffee, Teresa told them a story that changed everything. She had been a housekeeper for Marcus Boone's first wife, a young woman named Catherine who had died under suspicious circumstances 5 years earlier. The official story was that Catherine had fallen from a horse, but Teresa had seen the bruises, had heard the arguments, had cleaned up blood that came from fists rather than accidents. "I could not speak out then," Teresa said, her voice heavy with old regret. "Senor Boone threatened my family and I was afraid, but when I heard he was trying to force another young woman into marriage, I knew I had to say something. Catherine died because she was trapped with no one to help her. I will not let that happen again. Will you testify to this?" Quinton asked, hope rising in his chest. "I will," Teresa said firmly. "And I know others who worked in that house, who saw things they were too afraid to mention. Together we can show what kind of man he really is." Over the next 3 days, Quinton and Evangeline worked tirelessly to gather evidence and testimony about Marcus Boone's past. Teresa introduced them to a doctor who had treated Catherine Boone's injuries and had been told to keep quiet, to a ranch hand who had witnessed Boone beating his wife and had been fired when he tried to intervene, to a former business partner who could attest to Boone's ruthless and illegal practices. They compiled statements, gathered documents, and built a case that painted a picture of a violent, corrupt man who used wealth and intimidation to get his way. On the 6th day, they presented everything to Sheriff Coleman. The sheriff read through the materials with increasing grimness, and when he finished, he looked up at them with something like respect. "This changes things," he said slowly. "If even half of what is alleged here is true, Marcus Boone has no business claiming any kind of moral authority to demand marriage, and some of these business practices, if they can be proven, are criminal." "So you will help us?" Evangeline asked. "I will do better than that," Coleman replied. "I will contact the territorial marshal. Boone may have influence here, but he does not own the whole territory." When Marcus Boone returned on the 7th day with a preacher and his hired men, he found Sheriff Coleman waiting with a federal marshal and a warrant for his arrest on charges of fraud, assault, and extortion. The look of shock on Boone's face was deeply satisfying to Quinton, who stood beside Evangeline on the steps of the shop, watching justice finally catch up to a man who had thought himself above it. Boone sputtered and threatened, claiming the charges were fabrications, but when several witnesses stepped forward to publicly repeat their statements, his bluster faded. He was taken into custody, and his hired men, seeing which way the wind was blowing, rode out of town without him. The territorial marshal, a lean man named James Sullivan, approached Quinton and Evangeline after Boone had been secured in the jail. "You two did good work gathering this evidence," he said. "It is not often we see citizens stand up to men like Boone. If you ever need anything, you send word to me." As Sullivan rode away with his prisoner, Evangeline turned to Quinton, and the relief on her face was almost painful to see. "It is really over," she said wonderingly. "He cannot hurt me any more." "You did that," Quinton said, pulling her close. "You were brave enough to stand up to him, to find the truth. I just helped. We did it together, she corrected. Everything we do together. That night they celebrated quietly in the shop, and the conversation turned naturally to the future. With Boone gone and the threat lifted, they could finally make real plans without fear hanging over them. I want to marry you, Quinton said suddenly, setting down his coffee cup and taking both her hands in his. I know we have not been together long by traditional standards, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I am worthy of the chance you gave me. Evangeline's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. Yes, yes, I will marry you. I cannot imagine my life without you in it now. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small Catholic church on the edge of town. Teresa Morales stood as witness, along with the 2 women who worked in their shop, and Sheriff Coleman gave Evangeline away, having grown fond of the couple during their ordeal. It was a small wedding, nothing like the grand affairs Evangeline had seen in Santa Fe, but it was theirs, and that made it perfect. The summer of 1879 was the happiest time either of them had known. Their business continued to grow, and they moved to a larger space on the main street of Socorro, with room for more employees and a proper living area upstairs. Quinton proved to have a head for business, negotiating fair contracts with the mining companies and building relationships with suppliers that kept their costs low. Evangeline's reputation for quality work spread throughout the territory, and they began to receive orders from as far away as Albuquerque and Las Cruces. But it was not just their professional success that made them happy. It was the small moments. Morning coffee shared on their balcony overlooking the street, evening walks through town as the sun set over the mountains, quiet nights reading aloud to each other from the books Quinton borrowed from the territorial library. They learned each other's rhythms and moods, the way long married couples do, and built a foundation of trust and affection that felt unshakable. In August, Evangeline realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a mixture of joy and terror, memories of her mother's difficult pregnancies and her brother's death making her afraid of what might come. But Quinton's steady support and the care of Teresa, who had become a surrogate grandmother to them both, helped ease her fears. Whatever happens, we face it together, Quinton reminded her whenever the worry became too much. You are not alone in this. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through fall and into winter, and as Evangeline's belly grew, so did their preparations for the baby. Quinton built a cradle with his own hands, working late into the evenings to sand it smooth and paint it white. Evangeline sewed tiny clothes from soft fabric, marveling at how something so small could inspire such fierce love. Their son was born on a cold February morning in 1880, after a labor that lasted nearly 20 hours. Quinton stayed by Evangeline's side throughout, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement even when she cursed him for his role in her suffering. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced, the midwife placed him in Evangeline's arms and both parents wept at the miracle of him. "He is perfect," Evangeline whispered, her finger tracing the baby's tiny features. "What should we name him?" Quinton asked, unable to look away from his son. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at the baby, Evangeline said, Thomas Morrison, after your father." Quinton's eyes filled with fresh tears. His father had been a good man, dedicated to education and kindness, and the idea of honoring him this way felt right. "Thomas," he repeated, testing the name. "I think he would have been proud." Parenthood changed them in ways both expected and surprising. The easy intimacy of their early marriage gave way to exhaustion and the constant demands of a newborn, but it also deepened their bond. They moved through the sleepless nights and endless diaper changes as a team, supporting each other when one faltered, celebrating small victories like Thomas's first smile or the first full night of sleep he gave them at 4 months old. The business required adjustments too. Evangeline returned to work more slowly than she had anticipated, her body taking time to heal and her attention divided by the baby. Quinton took on more responsibilities, and they hired another seamstress to help with the increased workload. It was challenging, balancing parenthood and business ownership, but they managed by being flexible and communicating constantly about what they needed from each other. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, Socorro itself was changing. The railroad was coming, bringing with it the promise of easier transport and expanded markets, but also the threat of larger companies that might undercut their prices. Quinton saw both opportunity and danger in these changes, and he began to think about ways they could adapt and expand to stay competitive. "What if we did not just mend clothes?" he proposed one evening as they sat watching Thomas play with wooden blocks on the floor. "What if we started making them from scratch? Work clothes designed specifically for miners and ranchers, sturdy and well-made. We could sell them directly and through general stores in other towns." Evangeline considered this, her business mind engaging with the possibilities. It would require more space, more employees, a significant investment in materials. "But we have the reputation and the customer base," Quinton argued. "And with the railroad coming, we could ship to markets we could never reach before. It is risky, but I think it could work." They discussed the idea for weeks, running numbers and talking to other business owners about the feasibility. In the end, they decided to take the risk, securing a loan from the territorial bank and leasing a small warehouse on the edge of town to use as a manufacturing space. They hired a pattern maker from Santa Fe and 6 seamstresses from Socorro and the surrounding area, training them in the specific techniques and quality standards Evangeline demanded. The expansion was terrifying and exhilarating. There were days when Quinton was certain they had overextended themselves, when the bills piled up faster than the revenue came in, when it seemed like they would lose everything they had built. But slowly, steadily, the new venture began to pay off. Their work clothes gained a reputation for durability and fit, and orders came in from mining operations and ranches throughout New Mexico and into Arizona. By the summer of 1881, they had paid off their loan and were turning a steady profit. "We did it," Evangeline said one evening as they reviewed the books, Thomas asleep upstairs in his bed. "We actually built something real." "You did it," Quinton corrected. "Your vision, your skills, your refusal to give up, I just helped execute it." "No," she said firmly, taking his hand. "We did this together, every step of the way. That night you were sold for shelter when I bought you dinner, I could never have imagined this, that we would build a life, a family, a business, that you would become everything to me." Quinton pulled her close, kissing her deeply. "You saved me that night. You gave me hope when I had none, purpose when I was adrift. Everything I have become is because you saw something in me worth saving." Their success brought new challenges but also new opportunities. They became prominent members of the Socorro community, their opinions sought on matters of business and civic development. When the town needed funds to build a new school, Quinton and Evangeline were among the largest donors. When a fire destroyed several homes in the Mexican section of town, they organized relief efforts and provided employment to those who had lost everything. Teresa Morales, now in her 70s, became a permanent part of their household, helping with Thomas and managing the domestic side of their increasingly busy lives. She taught Thomas Spanish alongside English, told him stories of her childhood in Mexico, and provided the grandmotherly love that Evangeline's own mother had never lived to give. In 1882, Evangeline became pregnant again, and this time the experience was less frightening. She knew what to expect, and her body handled the pregnancy with more ease. Their daughter was born in October, a tiny thing with Quinton's dark hair and Evangeline's green eyes, and they named her Margaret, after Evangeline's mother. With 2 children and a thriving business, their lives became a careful dance of schedules and responsibilities. But they made sure to carve out time for each other, for their marriage, knowing that the foundation of their family was the love they shared. They took walks together after dinner, talked late into the night after the children were asleep, stole kisses in the warehouse when they thought no one was looking. The railroad finally arrived in Socorro in 1883, and with it came an explosion of growth and opportunity. Their business expanded again, shipping work clothes throughout the Southwest and even into Colorado and California. They hired more employees, opened a retail storefront in addition to their manufacturing operation, and began to be recognized as one of the success stories of the territory. But success did not change who they were at their core. They remained generous with their community, remembering what it felt like to have nothing and determined to help others avoid that fate. When they learned that several families were living in desperate poverty on the outskirts of town, Quinton had an idea that would change everything. "What if we provided work for them?" he said to Evangeline one evening. "Not just employment, but training in real skills. We could teach them to sew, to do bookkeeping, to manage all the aspects of running a business. Give them a path out of poverty." "That is essentially a charity operation," Evangeline pointed out. "It would cost money with no guarantee of return." "Maybe," Quinton acknowledged. "But we have the resources now. And if we can help even a few families build better lives, is that not worth something?" Evangeline smiled, reaching out to touch his face. "This is why I love you. You never forget where you came from, and you never stop wanting to help others." They started small, hiring 3 people from struggling families, and providing not just employment but housing assistance, food, and comprehensive training. The program was experimental, and some in the community criticized it as foolish charity that would only encourage dependence. But Quinton and Evangeline persisted, believing that people needed opportunity more than they needed handouts. The results exceeded their expectations. The people they hired worked with desperate gratitude and determination, learning quickly and contributing meaningfully to the business. More than that, they took what they learned and taught others, spreading skills and knowledge through their community. Within a year, several of their trainees had moved on to start their own small businesses, using the skills and confidence they had gained to build something for themselves. Word spread about what Quinton and Evangeline were doing, and others began to replicate their model. Business owners in Socorro and surrounding towns started hiring from the poorest sections of their communities, providing training and support that broke cycles of poverty. The territorial government took notice, and in 1885, the governor visited Socorro specifically to meet with the Morrisons and learn about their program. "What you have done here is remarkable," Governor Edmund Ross said as he toured their operation. "You have proven that compassion and good business are not mutually exclusive. I want to explore ways to replicate this throughout the territory." Quinton and Evangeline found themselves traveling to Santa Fe and Albuquerque, speaking to business associations and civic groups about their model for employment and training. Quinton, who had once been sold for a night's shelter, now stood before audiences of hundreds, telling his story and advocating for programs that gave people real chances to improve their lives. Evangeline, who had fled Santa Fe in fear and shame, returned there in triumph, her success and generosity earning her respect and admiration. Their influence grew beyond business and into social reform. They advocated for better wages for workers, for safety regulations in the mines, for schools that served all children regardless of background. They were not universally popular. Some called them radicals. Others accused them of meddling in matters beyond their concern, but they had the protection of success and the support of a community that had seen firsthand the good they did. By 1887, their original idea of providing employment and training had evolved into something much larger. They established the Morrison Foundation, funded by a portion of their business profits, dedicated to breaking cycles of poverty through education and opportunity. The foundation provided loans to aspiring entrepreneurs, funded schools in underserved areas, and created apprenticeship programs in various trades. It was ambitious work, and sometimes it felt overwhelming, but they were sustained by the knowledge that they were making a real difference. Thomas, now 7 years old, was bright and curious, with his father's love of books and his mother's practical intelligence. He helped in the warehouse sometimes, fetching thread or delivering messages, and listened with fascination to his parents' discussions of business and community improvement. Margaret, at 5, was a whirlwind of energy and stubbornness, determined to do everything her older brother did and unafraid to argue when told she was too young. Teresa, though slowed by age, remained a vital part of their household. She was the one who reminded them to rest when they worked too hard, who made sure the children learned kindness alongside ambition, who kept their home feeling like a home even as their public lives grew increasingly demanding. In the summer of 1888, Evangeline discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise given that they had not been trying for another child. At 32, she felt old for pregnancy, but her body proved resilient, and the pregnancy progressed smoothly. Their second son was born in February of 1889, a robust baby with a powerful set of lungs, and they named him Daniel, simply because they both liked the name. Life settled into a new rhythm with 3 children, and an enterprise that now employed over 50 people directly, and had helped hundreds more through the Foundation's programs. Quinton and Evangeline were in their early 30s, no longer the desperate young people who had met in a saloon 10 years earlier, but mature adults with responsibilities and influence. Yet they never forgot what it felt like to have nothing, and that memory informed every decision they made. The 1890s brought new challenges and changes to the Southwest. New Mexico inched closer to statehood, bringing political upheaval and opportunity. The Morrison Company, as their business was now known, expanded into new markets and products, adding leather goods and boots to their line of work clothes. The foundation grew as well, establishing offices in 5 cities and helping to shape territorial policy on education and labor. Thomas entered his teenage years with clear signs of his parents' business acumen and their passion for social reform. He worked summers at the warehouse and the foundation offices, learning every aspect of the operations from the ground up. Margaret, now 11, declared her intention to become a lawyer so she could fight for workers' rights, a pronouncement that made both her parents simultaneously proud and concerned about the battles she would face as a woman in that field. Daniel, at 5, was still young enough that his future remained uncertain, but he showed signs of his father's gentleness and his mother's fierce determination. The turn of the century found Quinton and Evangeline in their 40s, silver threading through their hair, but their energy and commitment undiminished. The Morrison Company was now one of the largest employers in Socorro, and the foundation's work had been recognized nationally as a model for how private enterprise could address social problems. They had been invited to Washington to speak to congressional committees about poverty and opportunity in the territories, and their influence reached far beyond the borders of New Mexico. But for all their success and influence, what mattered most to them remained what it had always been: each other, their family, their community. They still took evening walks together, still talked late into the night about their dreams and concerns, still looked at each other with the same love and gratitude that had marked their early days together. In 1902, on the anniversary of the night they met, Quinton and Evangeline stood on the balcony of their home, looking out over the town that had become theirs in every meaningful way. The street below was busy with evening traffic, people walking home from work or heading to the saloon for dinner and conversation. Some of those people owed their jobs, their skills, their very survival to the programs Quinton and Evangeline had created. "You remember that night?" Quinton asked, his arm around her waist. "When I was nothing, had nothing, and you gave me a chance." "You were never nothing," Evangeline said firmly. "You were just waiting for the right opportunity. I just happened to be there to provide it." "You saved my life," Quinton said. "Not just by giving me food and shelter, but by seeing me as human when the world had reduced me to something less. Everything I have done since then, everything we have built, comes back to that moment of basic kindness." "And you," Evangeline said, turning to face him, "you became the light that saved thousands. People who were where you were, desperate and forgotten, found hope because you refused to forget what that felt like. You took your pain and transformed it into purpose. That is what I admire most about you." They kissed as the sun set behind the mountains, two people who had found each other in the darkness and built a life of light. Below them, Socorro hummed with activity, a town transformed in part by their vision and dedication. Children played in streets that were safer because of their advocacy. Workers returned to homes they could afford because of the jobs they provided. Young people studied in schools that existed because of their donations. The ripples of that one act of kindness in 1878 had spread wider than either could have imagined. Thomas came home from his work at the foundation that evening with news that another town in Arizona wanted to replicate their employment training program. Margaret arrived shortly after with a letter of acceptance to a women's college in California where she would study law. Daniel bounded in from playing with friends, full of energy and questions about dinner. The family gathered around the table that evening, as they did most evenings, sharing food and conversation and laughter. Teresa, now in her 80s but still sharp, told stories from her childhood that the children never tired of hearing. Quinton and Evangeline exchanged glances across the table, the kind of wordless communication long married couples develop, saying everything without words. After the children had gone to bed and Teresa had retired to her room, Quinton and Evangeline sat together in their parlor, reviewing papers for the next day's meetings. It was comfortable, domestic work, the kind that had filled most of their evenings for years. But tonight, Quinton set down his papers and took Evangeline's hand. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what comes next. We have built something remarkable here, but I want to make sure it outlasts us. I want to ensure that the foundation and the company continue to serve people the way we intended, even after we are gone." "You are talking about succession planning," Evangeline said, "about making sure our children are ready to take over." "Partly," Quinton agreed. "But also about documenting what we have learned, creating systems that do not depend on us personally. I want our work to be institutional, not just personal. They talked late into the night, making plans for the future that extended beyond their lifetimes. It was sobering work, confronting their own mortality, but also hopeful, knowing that what they had built would continue to touch lives long after they were gone. Over the next several years, they worked to implement those plans. Thomas, who had graduated from college in 1903 with degrees in business and social work, took increasing responsibility for both the company and the foundation. Margaret, after completing her law degree in 1907, returned to New Mexico to open a practice focused on labor law and advocacy for workers' rights. Daniel, still finding his path, showed aptitude for design and began working on new products for the company. Quinton and Evangeline gradually stepped back from day-to-day operations, transitioning to advisory roles while their children took the lead. It was difficult at times, letting go of the enterprise that had been their life's work, but they found satisfaction in watching the next generation take what they had built and make it their own. Teresa Morales passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1908, at the age of 87. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched, and Quinton and Evangeline mourned her as the family member she had become. They buried her in the Socorro cemetery, under a headstone that read "Beloved Friend and Grandmother," and planted roses around her grave that bloomed every summer. The years passed, marked by both joy and sorrow as all lives are. Thomas married a teacher named Sarah in 1909, and they gave Quinton and Evangeline their first grandchild in 1910. Margaret married a fellow lawyer in 1911, a partnership of equals that seemed to promise happiness. Daniel, always the artistic one, married a potter in 1913, and they collaborated on beautiful designs that expanded the company's product line in unexpected directions. Quinton and Evangeline watched their grandchildren grow, teaching them the same lessons about kindness and opportunity that had guided their own lives. They traveled some, visiting places they had only read about in books, but always returned to Socorro, which would forever be home. In 1915, New Mexico achieved statehood, something Quinton and Evangeline had advocated for and worked toward for decades. They attended the celebration in Santa Fe, now in their late 50s, but still vigorous and engaged. The new state government recognized their contributions with official commendations, and several legislators cited the Morrison Foundation's work as evidence of the kind of innovation and compassion that would define the new state. The First World War brought challenges and changes, as wars always do. The Morrison Company shifted some production to military uniforms, contributing to the war effort while maintaining their commitment to fair wages and good working conditions. The foundation expanded its programs to support families of servicemen, providing financial assistance and job training for those left behind. Thomas served briefly in France as a supply officer, returning home in 1919 with new perspectives on the world and a deeper appreciation for the stability and opportunity his parents had created. Margaret threw herself into advocacy work, fighting for better treatment of returning veterans and their families. Daniel, exempted from service due to poor eyesight, kept the company running smoothly during the war years, proving his worth as a leader in his own right. The 1920s found Quinton and Evangeline in their 60s, officially retired but still deeply involved in the community and the causes they cared about. They had more time for each other now, for long walks and quiet conversations, for traveling to visit their scattered grandchildren, for simply being together. The passion of their youth had mellowed into a deep contentment, a love so integrated into the fabric of their lives that it no longer needed declaration, only expression in the thousand small acts of consideration and affection that filled their days. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1919, their children organized a celebration that filled the town square. Hundreds of people came, many whose lives had been touched by the Morrisons' work over the decades. There were speeches and toasts, stories told and retold of specific acts of kindness that had changed trajectories, of opportunities given that had transformed lives. When it was Quinton's turn to speak, he stood with Evangeline beside him, his hand in hers as it had been for 40 years. "People call us philanthropists, reformers, business leaders," he said, his voice still strong despite his age. "But the truth is simpler. I was a man with nothing who was given a chance by a woman who saw past my circumstances to my potential. Everything else, the company, the foundation, the programs, the policies, all of it flows from that one act of recognition and kindness. Evangeline gave me back my humanity when the world had stripped it away, and I have spent every day since trying to offer that same gift to others." He turned to face her, and there were tears in his eyes. "You saved me, and through me, we saved others. Together, we have built a life of meaning and purpose, and I would do it all again exactly the same way for the privilege of spending these decades by your side." Evangeline kissed him then in front of everyone, and the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. It was a moment of pure joy, a celebration not just of their marriage but of what that marriage had meant for so many others. The years continued to pass, each bringing new joys and new sorrows. Grandchildren grew and married, producing great-grandchildren who filled Quinton and Evangeline's home with noise and laughter on holidays. The company and foundation evolved with changing times, adapting to new economic realities while maintaining their core mission. Socorro itself grew and modernized, though it never lost the character that had made it home. In 1928, Quinton suffered a heart attack that left him weakened but alive. The doctors said he needed to slow down, to avoid stress, to accept his age and limitations. For a man who had been perpetually active, it was a difficult adjustment, but Evangeline was there, as she had always been, helping him navigate this new reality. They spent more time together than ever, sitting on their porch watching the world go by, receiving visits from children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling stories of their long life together. Quinton wrote some, documenting the history of the foundation and the principles that had guided their work, wanting to leave a record for future generations. Evangeline returned to sewing occasionally, not for business but for pleasure, making quilts for each of their great-grandchildren with fabric that told stories through its patterns and colors. In the spring of 1932, they celebrated their 53rd wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner at home, just the two of them and a few close family members. Quinton, now 78 but seeming older after his illness, raised his glass in a toast. "To the woman who changed my life," he said, "who took a desperate man sold for a night's shelter and loved him into becoming something more. Every good thing in my life traces back to you, Evangeline. You are my beginning, my middle, and my end. You are everything." Evangeline's eyes filled with tears as she raised her own glass. "And you are mine. We have had a remarkable life, have we not? From nothing to this, from strangers to the deepest possible connection. I would not trade a single day of it, not even the hard ones." They clinked glasses and drank, and the love between them was so palpable that even their grandchildren, too young to fully understand, felt it and knew they were witnessing something rare and precious. Quinton passed away peacefully in his sleep on a warm June night in 1933. Evangeline beside him as she had been for 55 years. His death was mourned throughout New Mexico and beyond, with newspapers running long obituaries detailing his rise from desperate poverty to influential businessman and philanthropist. But the truest tributes came from the ordinary people whose lives he had touched, who lined up to pay their respects and share stories of how a job, a loan, a kind word from Quinton Morrison had changed everything for them. Evangeline grieved deeply but with dignity, sustained by her children, and the knowledge that Quinton's legacy would continue through the work they had built together. She lived 3 more years, staying active in the foundation and the company, still sharp and engaged despite her age. She spent time with her great-grandchildren, telling them stories of their great-grandfather, making sure they understood that greatness could come from humble beginnings, and that kindness was the most powerful force in the world. On a cold February morning in 1936, Evangeline Harper Morrison died at the age of 79, her children and grandchildren around her bed. Her last words were, "Tell Quinton I'm coming," and those who heard them said she smiled as she spoke, as though she could already see him waiting for her. They buried her next to Quinton in the Socorro cemetery, under a shared headstone that bore both their names and a simple inscription chosen by their children. They were sold for shelter, but became the light that saved thousands. The Morrison Company and the Morrison Foundation continued for decades after their founders' deaths, adapting to new times and new challenges, but always holding fast to the core principles Quinton and Evangeline had established. The company eventually became a worker-owned cooperative, with employees having real ownership stakes and decision-making power, a natural evolution of the values its founders had embodied. The foundation expanded its reach nationwide, pioneering programs that broke cycles of poverty through education, training, and opportunity. Historians studying the economic and social development of the Southwest inevitably encountered the Morrison story, that remarkable tale of 2 desperate people who found each other and used their connection to transform not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others. Academic papers were written analyzing their business model, their approach to social reform, their marriage as a partnership of equals in an era when such things were rare. But the truest measure of their impact was not in historical records or economic analyses. It was in the lives lived, the opportunities taken, the cycles of poverty broken. It was in the great-great-grandchildren who grew up hearing stories of ancestors who had been saved by Morrison Foundation programs and went on to build good lives. It was in the workers who earned fair wages and benefits because Quinton and Evangeline had fought for labor protections. It was in the schools that existed because they had donated land and money to build them. Every person they had helped directly helped others in turn, creating ripples of positive change that spread far beyond what any individual could see or measure. A man given a job in 1885 taught his children the value of hard work and education, and his granddaughter became a doctor who served poor communities for 40 years. A woman trained as a seamstress in 1890 started her own business that employed dozens and supported multiple families through the Depression. A child who attended a Morrison Foundation school became a teacher who inspired hundreds of students over a 30-year career. The night that Quinton Morrison was sold for shelter, desperate and broken in a Socorro saloon, he could not have imagined the life that awaited him. He could not have known that the green-eyed woman who bought him dinner would become his wife, his partner, the love of his life. He could not have foreseen the business they would build, the foundation they would create, the thousands of lives they would touch. But Evangeline Harper had seen something in him that night, something worth saving and nurturing. And in saving him, she had saved herself, finding in their partnership a purpose and fulfillment that neither could have achieved alone. Together, they had proven that love could be practical as well as romantic, that compassion and success were not mutually exclusive, that two people committed to each other and to serving others could change their corner of the world in profound and lasting ways. Their story became legend in Socorro and throughout New Mexico, told and retold to new generations as an example of what was possible when people refused to let circumstances define them, when they chose kindness over cynicism, connection over isolation, service over self-interest. It was a love story, certainly, one of the great ones, but it was also a story about redemption, opportunity, and the transformative power of seeing and being seen as fully human. Decades after their deaths, the house where Quinton and Evangeline had raised their children became a historical landmark, preserved as a museum dedicated to their lives and work. Visitors walked through rooms where crucial decisions had been made, where children had played, where two people had built a life together against all odds. They saw the original sewing machine Evangeline had used, the cradle Quinton had built for their firstborn, the desk where they had drafted the charter for their foundation. But the real memorial to Quinton and Evangeline Morrison was not in preserved rooms or historical markers. It was in the living legacy of their work, in the foundation that still operated according to their principles, in the company that still treated workers with dignity and fairness, in the thousands of people across multiple generations whose lives had been touched, directly or indirectly, by two people who had found each other in a moment of mutual desperation, and transformed that meeting into something extraordinary. On quiet evenings in Socorro, when the sun set behind the mountains and the town settled into evening routines, old-timers still told the story of the man who was sold for a night's shelter, and the woman who saw past his circumstances to his worth. They told of how that meeting had sparked a love that burned steady for over 50 years, and how that love had radiated outward, warming and lighting the lives of thousands. They told it as a reminder that every person had value, that circumstances did not define destiny, and that sometimes, in the most unlikely moments, two souls could find each other and together become something far greater than they ever could have been alone. The story of Quinton and Evangeline Morrison was a testament to the truth that love, when combined with purpose and action, could indeed save thousands. Not through grand gestures or heroic sacrifices, though there had been elements of both in their lives, but through consistent, daily choices to see people as human, to offer opportunity where others saw only risk, to believe that everyone deserved a chance to build a better life. They had lived that truth every day of their lives together, and in doing so, they had proven that even the most desperate beginning could lead to the most extraordinary ending.